Perfect. G'day everybody. Let me just switch this over. Right, we'll give it a whirl and we'll see how bad my mouse skills are. Alrighty, mine's probably the longest disclaimer of them all since it's 2 pages today. First off though, I would like to really acknowledge the team that has built this. It takes many, many people to raise a discovery, and there's a list of names on the screen and it's only a few of the people that have really contributed to this. This has been a mammoth effort. And I'd also like to acknowledge the Taungurung people on whose the land we're exploring, and I'm very grateful for their support, as well as the Mitchell Shire Council, who are our local council. So, who is Southern Cross Gold? Well, there's our team. We're a very small team. We've got 5 geos for 5 drill rigs, so it keeps us very, very busy. But essentially what we are is exploring for epizonal gold in Victoria, and our aim is to demonstrate high grade, large volume, and it's on a scale that we can create economic mines. Our aim at the moment is to drill about 60 Ks over the next year, all diamond, all structurally orientated core, and we've got cash in the bank. I won't do any more corporate than that. Let's go into the history of it. So for context, when we last spoke at Mines and Wines, we would have been sitting somewhere around here on the graph. But originally in the 1850s, it was started with alluvial mining in the creeks, and then they slowly worked their way up to the hard rock, finding exposures and worked their way doing shallow shafts down to about 30 metres. Over time, they developed these down to the maximum depth of about 180 metres. Closed up shop. In the 1900s, they did some cyanide on the tailings, closed up shop again. Then World War I happened, and through the Imperial Munitions Act, all the mines reopened in this area, taking antimony in the form of stibnite to the local mines Costerfield, just up the road, and it continued processing for the war effort. And then as soon as the war was over, they shut again. Obviously, then nothing really happened for a while as the gold price was pretty low and antimony was never really heard of. Until 1960s, Eastern Prospectors chucked a couple of drill holes in, very few drill holes, really focusing on shallow oxide. And that was the main focus of Victoria and was up right until the Swan discovery, essentially, in the early 2017. So in 1980s, CRA and BHP did a couple of large costines. They got relatively broad widths of low grade, but moved on. And then the ground was held by Osmond, who started getting some, I think it was the second 100 gram metre hit on the project, so there's something interesting happening. And then through 2008, another BDL Resources, a privately held company, and then rolled into a public company, drilled 30 RC holes with 7 diamond tails, once again focusing on the oxide, and once again, not much success. And then the ground was locked up until about 2020 when Mawson picked it up. Southern Cross Gold was spun out of Mawson in 2022, and we're going to spin back in and then change our name, but that's a story for another day. But essentially we started diamond drilling on this project straight away and just kept getting hits. And as you can see from the graph, when we were talking in 2022 at the last Mines and Wines, we had a reasonable number, around 10 100 gram metre hits. Since then, we've accelerated the drilling year on year, increasing the number of rigs until, as I said, we've got 5 on site at the moment. And 2023 was our first year that we had 28 plus 100 gram a tonne individual assays, and we had 6 greater than 1,000 gram individual assays. This year so far, we've had about 27 plus 100 gram a tonne gold assays and 2 plus 1,000 gram gold assays. So we're really starting to get into our stride on focusing on this high grade material and understanding what we're looking at. For some context of where we are, we're sitting about 60 Ks north of Melbourne, so it's a nice hour drive for me to go to work every day. We're pretty close to the Costerfield Mandalay Resources held antimony gold operation, as well as Fosterville's just sitting up the road. So there's some significant gold producers in the region. Now everybody always asks me, okay, you're near Melbourne, so that means it's pretty hard to mine, you must be surrounded by houses. So I chucked on this wonderful view. This is us looking south towards Melbourne, and we've put over 55 kilometres now of drilling into this about 800 metre zone. So you can see we don't really have any landholders, but we've got about 14 houses within about 2.5 Ks, and slowly we've been buying a few of those. Also, the next question I often get is permitting. How are you going to do it? Isn't it hard to permit in Victoria? This is a very busy slide, I recognise, but it just shows that continual permitting has been occurring across the board in Victoria. Even the latest tailings dam approval by Mandalay Resources only just happened last month. So when we start combining all this in, why are we looking specifically for epizonal gold and what does that mean? So we've been talking so much, Ross gave a great talk on the Benambran and Tabarabaran, and if you came along on the field trip you would have heard me talk to this to no end. But essentially we're looking at two different times. So we've got the 440 million Benambran is in the green here, which was predominantly east-west compression forming chevron folds, the beautiful saddle reefs of the Bendigo zone. No real antinomy in high levels in that area, but you'd get a little bit of lead zinc kind of flavour and much more ductile textures. Whilst then at 380 we had a slight more northeast southwest compression. We had a much more distinct high antinomy flavour to the system, and that's what produced the likes of Costerfield and Fosterville and Sunday Creek. When I talk to this epizonal and this antinomy flavour, what does that actually mean? Epizonal is typically sub 6 kilometres, we're very shallow, we're very cool temperatures. So we're looking at sub 250 degrees to drop out stibnite, up to say 300 because we're starting to see sulphur salts at depth. We see this transition from brittle to ductile transition where we see broad extension veins, and as we go deeper we see a focus of more shear veins. This is typified by the Fosterville deposit where at 700 metres below surface you start seeing more shear veins compared to their disseminated and brittle features. That's what this graph is somewhat showing. So essentially we're looking at arsenic relative to antinomy as assays and using that as a proxy for temperature. So high levels of antinomy is sub 250 degrees, and when we start increasing the arsenic we're increasing our temperature. So around the 600 to 700 metres below surface we're starting to see a change, and we start to see an increase in frequency of these ductile or complex shear veins. So what we're comparing to is at the surface we're seeing a lot more just dominant brittle features like classic extension veins with comb textures, open space breccias with infill, and then as we go deeper we see these high grade cores sitting in, and these have polyphase textures. We've got breccias, we've got banded sections, and usually a lot more visible gold sitting in these areas. I'm just going to zoom out a touch before we'll focus into the main drill area. So where we're drilling currently and our main focus is in the retention license here, which is the Christina, Golden Dyke, Rising Sun and Apollo prospects. But we have been doing a hell of a lot of regional mapping of late and now traced the dike that is our major host for over 10 kilometres along strike and started to pick up some parallel structures, with one being the aftermath trend, which is a historic working, and we actually found one down in the creek one day. This has also got some soils plotted all across it. Sorry, Scott, I converted it into an element additive index to make it easier for everybody, but essentially what we've found is there's a classic zonation of arsenic, antinomy, gold, as well as a manganese component to our system, and it really gives us these beautiful bullseye targets over all the known historic workings, as well as highlighting a lot of other targets along the strike of these that we haven't had any exploration over. And our plan is to expand this grid over time and continue working this up. So when we zoom into the main drill area and we have a look at the Sunday Creek deposit, we're looking, as I said, the Apollo, Rising Sun, Golden Dyke and Christina. And what does it look like? It gets a little complex in the terms that we're looking at two structures that are orthogonal to each other. So we have atypical of Victoria, a east-west trending dike that is actually orthogonal to our fold axes, which are trending in a northwesterly orientation. This dike is surrounded by a bleached altered sedimentary package, which then has a further pyrite halo sitting around it. And then outside of that, there's also the invisible halo of a fengitic to muscovitic as we get proximal, with a slight ammonium mica flavour when we get very, very close to our mineralisation. But the beautiful thing is that this host is very rheologically strong and competent compared to our surrounding turbidite sequence, so we essentially have a rheological contrast. The way I like to describe it is you take an empty bucket, fill it with sand, that's our turbidites, place a porcelain plate in it vertically, and that's our dike, and if I squish my bucket, I'm going to break the plate first. So that's our focus and locus for our fluid, and that's why we get so much mineralised focus into this area. Now the veins and the mineralisation themselves are typically trending north-northwesterly, which is very much the classic Melbourne zone orientation. They're very steep and steep ore shoots because locally, as I said, whilst regionally we're under compression and the Tabarabaran influence, we seem to locally be under extension in this area. And so we form a whole array of vein sets that are all trending in this northwesterly orientation. We can trace them down now to about 1.1 k's depth. They repeat every 5 to 10 to 20 metres. They're typically anywhere from 2.5 to 3.5 kind of metre zones. And then their strike is around the 20 to 100 metres maximum. Typically we average about 40 metres strike for each vein. Taking a slice as a cross-section through that so we can see the alteration a bit better, I really wanted to highlight how visually easy it is, I guess, to know that we're coming into the mineralised system. We go from the classic grey siltstones, mudstones that are typical of Victoria, and as we approach the centre of our dike system, we see a clear bleaching of intense carbonate and sericite cementation, and it really increases as we get to our dike, and then we see also local fuchsite within the dike. Now, it's a mafic to intermediate dike, so it's a pretty classic alteration halo, and we do see localised areas of silicification further strengthening the rock and increasing that competency contrast. Invisible, as I said, out in the unaltered sediment, we also see a geochemical anomaly. So here I've just coloured it up by lithology, but essentially outside of our pyritic halo, which typically extends for up to 150 metres away from our dike structure, we see upwards of another 80 to 170 metres away a classic arsenic and antimony elevation compared to the regional background. So we've got this very large footprint, and the way I like to say it is big footprint, big deposit. Taking a slice through the veins so we can get the full geological understanding of what I'm talking about. We start with a disseminated pyrite and arsenopyrite on occasion, and then as we approach the centre of our vein set array or our structural corridor, we'll start to see an increase in our extensional vein arrays, which are highlighted here as our consistently orientated extension veins all running through here, and that would be the section of number 2. These are anywhere from 0.5 metre to 10 metres wide true thickness. They typically range from plus a gram to about the 12 to 20 grams and are only about 0.1 to 5% antimony. Then usually in the centre of these systems we'll find what we call a high-grade core or a complex shear vein. Now this is, as the example is in here, it's a thicker individual vein. It's a single vein typically, and it's got those complex vein textures. It's anywhere from 10 centimetres to 1.5 metres true thickness. It's plus 5% antimony typically, or we see a high presence of sulfur salts at depth, and typically anywhere of plus 20 grams to plus thousands of grams. This is the real aim of the game, and it's our main focus. When we're looking at these and these high grades, how do we link them together? It all comes down to structurally orientated drill core, so all the structural geos will be loving some stereo nets slipping in there, but I've also pretended to be a geostats and chucked in some CVs as well. So we really focus on maintaining a high confidence of our geological data and making sure we're mapping the difference between shear veins and extension veins, as well as what the mineralogy and textures are present. And when we start pulling that all apart and looking at it, we can see we've got a really clear clustered setting of really steep and really east and west dipping features. We do get some linking features that are typically a relay extension veins jumping across or exploiting local bedding trends. But the great thing about the stibnite bearing veins is they match in with the visible gold bearing veins, which is great because typically we see that they're both the same mineralogy. The really interesting thing is the early pyritic halo that we see and the mineralisation associated with that is trending along the lithological control of the dike. So we get this early start as the system's really starting to kick along. The alteration is preferentially going along that dike, and then as we really start heating up and creating these fluid networks, they're now going the dominant Tabarabaran orientation of north to the northwest. When we subdomain and model our structures in this manner of making sure we're using the geological likeness, matching textures, matching the geology we observe, and matching structural orientations, so we're not just linking high grade to high grade, we end up with some really good geostats coming out, and that's really encouraging for us. We see typically matching in with our structural orientations that the variography of our deposit is suggesting a higher continuity on the steep orientation, which is matching in with an extensional setting. We can see as well when we subdomain these high-grade domains, we get really consistent CVs, say sub 1.5, but these are plus 100 gram a tonne domains. So it's really significant value that we can make sure we can contain. And the real takeaway of this is more data, more geology equals a better CV and a better estimate at the end of the day and a better understanding. And how do we develop that understanding? We do like to go back to the old school cross sections. This one is an inclined plan view of our best hole on the project to date, which was hole 107, which ran 455 metres at about 7 grams across the entire mineralised interval that you can see on screen, with a highlight of 1 metre at 2,200 grams a tonne gold equivalent. And about 20% of our value of our project is held in the antimony side, so it is a significant component as a critical metal, but there's obviously all the high-grade gold sitting in there as well. And we really encourage our geos to understand what's going on in these systems, because as we're focusing on a 20 to 100 metre window of understanding, we are usually drilling parallel to either the veins or the dike structure. So what we typically do is we target from the north to the south and target our host corridor to really tie down that structure. And then we do what we call our east-west holes, which is like hole 107, where we're drilling across our mineralised intervals. What that looks like, if I zoom in a little, is we have consistent vein set arrays in these sheeted systems running through, and they have consistent grades, whether they're on the hanging wall of the system, within the dike, or even on the footwall. And 2 of our best hits to date, one has been hosted within the dike and one has been hosted in the altered sediment. So we know that there's not necessarily a grade preferential in either of these, but we do see once we start getting outside into the pyritic halo, the features start to trim in, and we haven't seen mineralisation outside of a pyritic halo, so we know that the pyrite is intimately associated with the mineralising event entirely. We're now going to run through a paragenesis, or our current paragenesis understanding of the deposit. So during the early Tabarabaran, we've started folding everything up. We've started compressing on a northeast to southwest orientation, creating gentle open folds. During that time, we have had a period of extension or localised extension that we've managed to push up a dike intruding through on an east-west orientation into the pre-existing fault architecture potentially sitting in there. I'll leave that one to Ross to argue over on whether there was a fault there or not. And then we've continued back into our compression regime. And the really great thing is we see that this continued brecciation and a mixture of dike in matrix or quartz matrix breccias around our axial planes. So within our synclines and our anticlines, we see an increase in brecciation and a thickening of the alteration package, which in itself then encourages further vein development. So we see a focus and increase in frequency of veining within these hinge areas. Then the mineralisation has started coming through, so we see it as a continuum and an evolving process. So we've started with that early pyritic halo interacting with all the wall rock. We've continued over-pressurising and we start cracking. When we start sealing, we crack open our veins, we decrease the pressure and the temperature, and because stibnite is such a temperature-pressure controlled element, when the pressure changes, the stibnite drops out, crystallises, and it drags the gold with it. This is the key component of Victorian, or especially the Melbourne zone geology, because that's how we get high grade as well as the high grade antimony, but as a continuous feature that is predictable and doesn't have that strong nugget effect that we see at, say, Bendigo, which is very much a different style and a different chemical control on the system. Then at the end of this, we've added a whole lot of post-mineral faulting, so sub-150 degree faulting through here, as they're full of illites and clays, very low temperature clays. These have all just slightly offset everything in a strike slip setting, as well as a couple of little thrust faults coming through as we've block accommodated and allowed everything to settle. So what does that look like in drill results? It gets a little messy when we try and look at single planes, and I wish I could spin it around for you in 3D today. But essentially what we've got here is we've been drilling in the Apollo area was our original starters. That's the historic mine that goes down to about 100 metres. Rising Sun is actually blind to surface, and only one of the vein sets that is actually present in Rising Sun outcrops on surface. All the rest are hidden beneath what we call the Golden Orb fault running through here. And then Golden Dyke, yesterday we released a drill hole, so it's fresh off the press, and that identified a new 135 metre true thickness kind of zone of mineralisation that we're now starting to explore, and we have a couple of holes that are in the lab and getting logged at the moment over in Christina. So we're really starting to step out along this footprint. As I said, it's a 10-kilometre trend, and we've only really been focusing on where the historic head frames were, but the plan is to continue stepping out. At the start of the year, we released an exploration target, so we're not at the resource stage yet, we're still drilling. We've put about 55 kilometres in to date, and the plan is another 60 over the next year, with the aim of upgrading this maiden exploration target. So originally we released 1 to 1.6 million ounces at around 7.2 to 9.7 gold equivalent, of which about 20% is antimony value. But the key that I really wanted to point out is over the last few months, you'll see the red highlighted boxes. These are all the holes that sit outside of that exploration target and are really starting to expand. So we recently drilled our deepest hole to date on the project, which came down at about 1.1 k's vertically, and we got 3.6 metres at 124 grams to the tonne gold equivalent. This is really our main aim for the next year. So we've got a stated aim to increase our exploration target to 3 million ounces at 10 grams gold equivalent. And so that's going to be my focus and the GEO's focus for the next couple of years. Metallurgically, we've only done a couple of initial tests with some additional tests in the work at the moment. We copied Costerfield's flow sheet as they're an antimony operation. Stibnite's a wonderful element in the fact that it floats beautifully, and so it's incredibly easy to recover. The beautiful thing about the arsenopyrites here on site is it seems to be non-refractory in its nature. It's a classic blocky shape rather than the refractory acicular shape that you'll see at Fosterville. And we got relatively good recovery, so I'm not going to go through the details. You guys can read it there. I'm not a geomet. I'm getting close to the end. So here I've just got a highlight of some of our top 10 holes to date on the project for the last 6 to 8 months. This has been where we've really been hitting this table frequently, and I've got some examples of what the core looks like. So if you came along the field trip, you would have seen one of these pieces of core there, which was our 7,000 gram best interval that we have assayed on the project to date. But the real one I wanted to highlight is we see higher grades associated with stibnite, and we also see it associated with fibrous sulfur salts. And these two examples really show what we see in the higher up portions, and as we transition down deeper, we start to see this more sulfur salt dominated area. And for the next, as I said, the next 12 months, we're aiming to drill 60 Ks. We're going to add an extra rig, so I probably need to log a bit more core myself, and continue that regional work as well. So we're planning to really hit the ground running along that 10K trend and really test more of it, as we've only hit about 3% drill tested, I think, to date along strike, and continue some of the base metal studies. So yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.